The sleet comes sideways off the Atlantic on the last February dusk of the old year's bitter tale, and it drives against the high iron gates of Harlow Castle as though it has a grievance with the stones themselves. The gatehouse lamp gutters in its bracket. Beyond the gate, a long dark avenue of beech trees bends toward a castle set upon a granite headland, and below the headland, unseen in the failing light, the sea thuds against the cliffs with the patience of a thing that has been thudding there since before any Harlow was born. A hired post-chaise rounds the last bend of the cliff road, its 2 tired bay horses blowing steam in the cold, its lamps yellow pinpricks in the murk. The postboy reins in at the gatehouse. He swings down. He opens the door. A young woman climbs out. She is perhaps 23, slender, of a good middle height, her honey-gold hair pinned in a smooth, low chignon half hidden beneath a plain black straw bonnet tied with grey silk ribbons. Her travelling pelisse is of dark charcoal wool with a black velvet collar. Her gloves are black kid. Her shawl is a plain cream wool drawn close at her throat. Her eyes, deep, clear sea grey, with a hint of pale blue-green in them, take in the gate, the beech avenue beyond, the dim bulk of the castle above, and show nothing of what she feels. A single trunk is set down beside her upon the wet gravel. The steward comes out of the gatehouse with a lantern. He is a tall-ish, wiry man of 52, iron-grey hair close-cropped and receding at the temples, steady grey-green eyes, a square, honest, Cornish-weathered face, a plain dark brown wool coat, a leather-bound ledger under one arm. He bows, gravely. He asks her name. She draws a breath that no one sees her draw. She says, in a warm, low contralto softened at the vowels by a Yorkshire girlhood she has not lost, "Ashton, if you please. Miss Ashton. I believe I'm expected." He inclines his iron-grey head. He says, "You are expected, Miss Ashton. Pray step within out of the weather." Inside the castle, 2 furlongs up the avenue and 3 stories above the gatehouse, the library lies deep and silent under the last of the day. Dark oak shelves climb to a carved ceiling. 11,000 volumes breathe their old paper breath into the warm air. A great hearth burns at one end of the room with a slow red heart of sea coal. 2 deep green leather wingback chairs are drawn toward the fire. In the nearer of the chairs, a man sits very still. He is tall, even-seated. One sees it in the length of the leg and the set of the shoulder. His coat is plain deep black superfine, his waistcoat black, his shirt open at the throat without a cravat, his trousers charcoal grey, his hessians polished. His hair is thick chestnut brown, slightly overlong, one lock fallen across the brow. On his knee lies a book he has not opened. His right hand rests quite still upon the silver top of a plain ebony walking stick. His eyes, large, long-lashed, pale grey blue and clouded, are fixed on nothing at all. A faint, pale silver line, the trace of a long-heeled mark, runs along the outer edge of the right eyebrow down to the temple. Behind him, at the library door, the housekeeper has paused with one hand upon the latch. She is a short, stout woman of 58, iron-grey hair in a neat low bun under a white linen cap, warm, pale blue eyes. She looks at the motionless figure by the fire, and then she looks down at her keys, and then she says, very softly, as though she is almost afraid to disturb the air of the room, "Your Grace, she has come." The man in the chair does not turn his head. He says nothing, but the knuckles of the hand upon the ebony whiten a very little, and the clouded, pale grey-blue eyes close once, slowly, and open again upon the fire they cannot see. He had been searching for a voice for 4 years. He had not meant to search by advertisement, but a single candle of hope in a castle upon the cliffs had been lit, and a woman in a grey pelisse was about to climb the stairs toward it. A month earlier, she had been Miss Rosalind Marlowe of Bloomsbury Square. Her uncle, Sir Edward Marlowe, a gentleman, a lover of violins and of old silver and of his orphaned niece, had died in the last week of September, 1811, of an illness that had been kind enough to take him in his sleep. He had left behind him a fair fortune, a library of very handsome books, a townhouse in Bloomsbury, and a plain letter in his own hand written 9 years before, in which he had named Rosalind the chief beneficiary of his estate, with a settlement also for his nephew, her cousin, Sir Percy Marlowe, who had already inherited a baronetcy and an estate in Yorkshire, and who, in Sir Edward's private view, was already quite provided for. 3 weeks after her uncle's funeral, a fresh will had been produced. Rosalind had sat in the front parlour of the Bloomsbury house on a cold morning in January, in plain black mourning, her honey-gold hair severely pinned, her sea-grey eyes dry, while a solicitor with an apologetic cough had read out a codicil, dated, he said, the week before Sir Edward's death, which revoked the earlier dispositions and left the whole of the estate to Sir Percy, save only £40 in banknotes and such of her mother's personal effects as might be shown to be indisputably her mother's. Sir Percy himself had stood at the parlour window with his back to the room while the codicil was read. He had turned at the end of it. The bottle-green tailcoat, the primrose-yellow waistcoat strained a little at the paunch, the thinning, sandy-blonde hair combed forward in the Brutus style, the small, shallow, pale-blue eyes set too close together, the permanent half-smile that did not move when his mouth moved. He had said in a voice of careful regret that he had practised, "Cousin, I am very sorry, but the will is clear. I cannot oppose my uncle's last wishes, however painful it may be to us both." It was not painful to him. She had seen that very plainly in the half-smile. She had been given a fortnight to remove herself. She had taken 5 days. She had packed 1 trunk, 2 gowns, a pelisse, linen, her mother's travel diary bound in calf, a miniature of her parents, a small silver cross on a black silk cord, a worn cowper, her music books. She had tied her bonnet with grey ribbons on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of January, 1812, and walked down the steps of the Bloomsbury house with the £40 in banknotes folded inside a reticule against her ribs, and a character reference from her late uncle's housekeeper, Mrs. Beale, tucked beside the banknotes. Sir Percy had not come down to see her go. She had taken a room for 3 nights at a respectable lodging-house in Half Moon Street, kept by a Mrs. Goodall, who remembered her mother, and had charged her half the usual rate, and scolded her into eating a mutton chop on the first evening. She had walked back to Half Moon Street in a thin January rain, and she had resolved, quite calmly, that she would not cry in a public street. On the morning of the 3rd day, she had bought a copy of the Morning Post for 3p from a boy on the corner of Piccadilly, and she had read it through at a coffee-house window, and on the 3rd column of the 4th page, beneath advertisements for a governess and a lady's companion and a discreet furrier, she had found a small notice set in plain type. Wanted, a gentlewoman of good reading voice and quiet habit, to read aloud to a gentleman of retired circumstance in Cornwall. Small but adequate stipend. Private apartment. Apply by letter to the steward, Harlow Castle, Boscastle. She had read it twice. She had folded the paper. She had gone back to Half Moon Street and, at Mrs. Goodall's little writing desk, upon a half-sheet of plain paper, she had composed a letter to the steward at Harlow Castle. She had signed it, Rosalind Ashton. Ashton had been her mother's name. Her mother, Harriet Ashton of Richmond in Yorkshire, had died when Rosalind was 17, and the name was a quiet thing in her mouth, warm as an old shawl. To use it was not deceit. It was, she told herself, a form of protection. if Sir Percy chose to put it about that she had gone into service, and Sir Percy, she knew, was quite capable of putting it about cruelly, she did not wish a Marlowe name followed into a stranger's house. She would be Miss Ashton in Cornwall. She would be Miss Marlowe again when she was able to be. The reply came by return of post, 4 days later. It was written in a plain, steady hand, and signed Hugh Trewin, Steward, Harlow Castle. It offered her the post at a stipend of £60 a year, a private apartment in the castle, and her board. It asked her to present herself at the gatehouse upon the last Wednesday of February. It did not name the gentleman to whom she was to read. She had packed a second time. She had paid Mrs. Goodall. She had taken the night stage coach from the Gloucester Coffee House on a Friday evening and had spent 3 days upon the Post Road West, passing through places she had known only from maps: Basingstoke, Salisbury, Honiton, Exeter, Oakhampton. At Launceston, she had slept a night at the coaching inn, a clean, narrow bedchamber above the taproom, the sheets smelling of lavender, and had eaten a bowl of soup at the ordinary. On the Wednesday morning, she had hired the post-chaise at the inn yard with the last of her uncle's banknotes, and had driven north and west through a cold day that thickened into sleet, through the bare hedgerows and the low grey stone walls of the North Cornish moor, past Camelford, past the turnpike at Davidstow, down the cliff road toward Boscastle and the sea. And so it was that at a little past 5 on the last Wednesday in February, 1812, she stood dripping in the gatehouse of Harlow Castle, with her single trunk at her feet, and made her curtsy to the steward, and gave the name of Ashton. Mr. Trewin led her into the gatehouse office. It was a plain square room with a small coal fire, a deal table, 2 wooden chairs, a shelf of ledgers, and a narrow window giving upon the avenue. He set his leather-bound ledger upon the table. He drew out a chair for her, and then, with a steward's quiet formality, sat opposite. He asked her a very few questions, in a voice that was kind without being soft: her age, her education, her last residence, the character reference. She produced Mrs. Beale's letter from her reticule and laid it upon the table. He read gravely and returned. He asked whether she had any experience of reading aloud to the afflicted. She answered truthfully that she had read to her late uncle during his last illness, and, as a girl, to her mother. He watched her while she spoke. He watched her the way a man watches a horse brought up for his inspection, not unkindly but carefully, noting the set of her head, the quiet of her hands in her lap, the cadence of her voice. A gentlewoman of her evident quality, applying for a reader's post at £60 a year, was not quite the ordinary case, and Mr. Trewin was not a man who pretended to himself that it was. But he did not press her. He said after a pause, "The terms are £60 per annum, Miss Ashton, paid quarterly. You will have a private apartment in the east tower of the castle. Your meals will be served you there, save when the family invites you otherwise. You will be required to read to His Grace for 1 hour each evening at 8 o'clock in the library. Upon Sundays, you are at liberty. Is this agreeable?" she said very calmly. "It is, Mr. Trewin. I accept the post." He nodded once. He rose. He said, "Then I shall have your trunk carried up. If you will step out with me, Miss Ashton, I shall conduct you to the castle myself. It is a fair walk in the weather, but a gig in this sleet would be more trouble than a pair of stout boots." She had stout boots. She had come prepared. They walked the long avenue of beech together in the failing light. The trees were old, planted, she thought, 150 years before by some Harlow whose bones were by now under the stones of the parish church, and the wet black branches met above the gravel in a kind of roof. The sleet pattered on the dead leaves underfoot. Mr. Trewin walked at her elbow with the lantern. He did not speak. She was grateful for his silence. The castle rose as they climbed. First the grey roof line against a greyer sky, then the battlements, then the great square gatehouse of the castle itself. Then, as they passed beneath the stone arch into a cobbled court, the lit windows of the hall. She had expected something grim and ruinous. What she found was a living house. Lamps burned at the mullioned windows. Smoke rose from 5 chimneys. A pair of castle dogs, great grey wolfhounds, padded out to greet Mr. Trowin with the gravity of old acquaintance and padded away again. He led her through a low oak door into the great hall. She stopped on the threshold, in spite of herself, and drew a small breath. The hall rose 2 stories to an open timber roof. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The long walls were hung with banners, faded, carefully preserved, the arms of the Harlow family, worked in azure and, or upon each, a silver falcon, wings half spread, perched upon a mailed gauntlet. Above the high table hung a great escutcheon of the same device, carved in oak and touched with gold leaf that caught the firelight and gave it back. She did not know the arms. She had never been in company that used them. She knew only that the falcon was beautiful, and that the gauntlet was steady, and that whoever lived under such a roof was very old in the land. Mr. Trowin did not pause in the hall. He led her through a side door, and along a stone-flagged corridor to a narrower passage, where a stout little woman in a black bombazine gown was waiting beside a lit candle. "Mrs. Pendarvis," said Mr. Trowin, "Miss Ashton is come. Miss Ashton, Mrs. Pendarvis is the housekeeper here. She will have charge of you." The housekeeper curtsied. She was short and brisk and warm, iron-grey hair in a neat low bun under a white linen cap with a narrow edging of lace, warm pale blue eyes, a soft, round, Cornish-weathered face, a bunch of keys on a silver chatelaine at her waist. She looked Rosalind once over. Pelisse, bonnet, dripping shawl, sea-grey eyes, the composed mouth, and Rosalind saw, though Mrs. Pendarvis said nothing, that she had been approved of at the first glance and might presently be loved. "Bless you, my dear," said Mrs. Pendarvis in a Cornish voice not unlike the steward's. "You are wet through. Come with me, and we shall have you dry and fed before you can say by your leave. Mr. Trowin, thank you. I shall see to her." Mr. Trowin bowed and was gone. Mrs. Pendarvis led her up a narrow winding stair of old stone, turning and turning about a central newel, past one landing and then another, until at last a small arched door gave upon a round chamber set high in the east tower. The room was very plain and very clean. A small fire burned upon the hearth. A narrow bed stood against the curved wall, made up with white linen and a dark wool coverlet. A writing desk of plain oak stood beneath a window, deep set in the thickness of the wall. A press for gowns stood in one corner, a washstand with a china ewer in another. A single rush-seated chair was drawn up to the fire. The stone walls had been whitewashed and hung with 2 small prints, a view of Tintagel, a view of St. Michael's Mount, and a strip of worn red carpet ran between the bed and the hearth. "It is not grand, Miss Ashton," said Mrs. Pendarvis, in a tone that was neither apologising nor excusing. "But it is warm, and it is yours." Rosalind stepped to the window. The sleet had slackened. Below the tower, beyond the walled garden, beyond the steep field where she could just make out the dark backs of sheep huddled against a wall, the Atlantic cliffs fell sheer into a churning sea. Even through the leaded glass, she could hear the faint, long thud of the surf against the stone. It was, she thought, the loneliest view she had ever looked upon. And yet, standing in the warmth of that small fire, her charcoal pelisse beginning to steam a little, she found herself strangely steadied by it. The sea had been there before her troubles, and would be there after. A castle upon a cliff did not much mind a forged codicil in Bloomsbury. "A tray will be sent up, my dear," said Mrs. Pendarves behind her. You will dine quiet in your own room tonight. His Grace does not expect you in the library until tomorrow evening at 8. If you will give me your wet things, I shall have them dried at the kitchen fire. And is there anything, Miss Ashton, that you lack?" Rosalind turned. She said with a small smile she had not known she had in her, "Only my bearings, Mrs. Pendarves, and those I believe I shall come by." The housekeeper patted her sleeve. "You will do," she said. "You will do very well." And she was gone, with her keys chiming softly down the stone stair. The tray came up presently, carried by a round-faced kitchen maid in a clean white apron who bobbed a curtsy and did not stare. It was a simple supper: a quarter loaf of brown bread, still warm from the oven, a slice of cold mutton on a willow pattern plate, a small jug of country small beer, a pat of yellow butter, a white napkin. Rosalind drew the rush-seated chair to the desk, ate slowly, and thought of nothing in particular. She had learned, during her month of homelessness, that one eats best by not thinking at all. When the plate was empty, she carried the tray to the door and set it on the flags outside, as she fancied a servant of the house would do. She washed her hands and her face at the china ewer. She changed out of the grey muslin travelling gown for a plain, high-waisted, slate-grey muslin with a white lace fichu tucked at the neck, her small silver cross on its black silk cord at her throat, and drew her cream cashmere shawl about her shoulders. She sat down at the writing desk under the deep window. She drew her mother's travel diary out of her reticule, calf-bound, worn at the corners, her mother's initials H.A. in a faded gold on the cover, and opened it to the first blank page after her mother's own last entry of the summer of 1799. She dipped the pen. She thought for a long moment. Then, in her clear, even hand, she wrote one line: "Cornwall is stone and sea, and I have a roof and a name and a stipend. That is more than I had yesterday. It must therefore be enough." She blotted it. She closed the diary. She sat a little while at the window, watching the last smoky grey of the sky darken into a wet black night over the Atlantic, and listening to the faint, steady breathing of the sea against the cliffs below. Somewhere beneath her, 3 stories down and a stone passage away, a fire burned in a library of 11,000 books, and a man sat in a deep green leather chair with his hand upon an ebony walking stick and his clouded, pale grey-blue eyes fixed upon nothing at all. She had not yet met him. She had not yet learned his name. She was to read to him, Mrs. Pendarves had said, the following evening at 8 o'clock. Rosalind Marlowe, who was, for the present, Miss Ashton, rose from the window. She banked the little fire. She said her prayers, briefly, as her mother had taught her, and she laid herself down in the narrow bed under the dark wool coverlet, and closed her sea-grey eyes, and listened to the wind off the sea, and slept at last the good dreamless sleep of one who has crossed 200 miles of England in a week and come at the end of the road to a lit window. She woke to a pale grey sea light at the deep-set window, and for a moment could not remember where she lay. The coverlet was coarser than her own had been in Bloomsbury. The air smelled of cold stone and banked sea-coal ash. Then the long thud of the Atlantic against the cliffs below came up through the thickness of the tower wall, and she remembered. Harlow Castle, the East Tower, Cornwall, Miss Ashton. Rosalind lay a moment with her sea-grey eyes upon the whitewashed ceiling, put her hand to the small silver cross at her throat, and said her short morning prayer. Then she rose and parted the linen curtain upon her first Cornish day. The sleet had gone with the night. What remained was a clean, high-grey morning, cold and bright, a long scour of silver cloud blowing inland off the sea, The castle cast a black-grey shadow across the walled garden beneath her. Beyond the garden, the headland fell away in a sweep of wintered grass to the Atlantic cliffs, and beyond the cliffs, the sea lay in long bars of pewter and green, flecked white where the wind took it. 3 gulls turned above the chimneys, calling thin, harsh morning calls. I had thought it would be grim, she told herself, drawing her cream cashmere close. It is not grim. It is only old and plain and quite enormous. She washed at the china ewer and dressed. Slate-grey muslin, white lace fichu at the neck, silver cross, cream cashmere, and pinned her honey-gold hair in its smooth, low chignon, 2 small wisps escaping at the temples. Presently there came a soft knock upon the arched door. Mrs. Pendarves entered, brisk and neat in black bombazine, a white linen apron pinned over the gown, the keys chiming at her chatelaine. A round-faced kitchen maid followed with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, my dear. I hope you slept." "I slept better than I deserved, Mrs. Pendarves. You are very good to bring it up yourself." "It is no great matter. I wished to see how you did upon your first waking." She surveyed Rosalind with her warm, pale blue eyes, and smiled a small, satisfied smile, as of a woman who has examined a piece of fine linen and found it honest cloth. "The sea air will soon put a colour in your cheek." The tray bore a small brown loaf, breathing steam, yellow butter, a white pot of honey, a rasher of bacon and 1 coddled egg upon willow pattern, a pewter coffee pot. "I took the liberty of the coffee," said Mrs. Pendarves. "His Grace drinks it, and I thought a London young lady might as soon." "Mrs." Pendarves drew up the rush-seated chair and settled herself with the sigh of a stout woman who has climbed 92 stone steps. She spoke, as Rosalind ate, of the ordering of the castle, the kitchens in the south wing, the still room and the housekeeper's pantry beneath, the chapel disused these 20 years, the library off the long gallery. She herself, Mrs. Pendarves, would fetch Miss Ashton at 7 minutes before the hour this evening. His Grace is a quiet gentleman. You are to read him an hour, no more, and he will thank you and bid you good night. Mr. Trowyn has set out 3 volumes upon the side table, and you shall choose among them. His Grace is reading to hear a voice, I fancy, more than to hear the page." She paused at the latch. "Oh, and Miss Ashton. You will hear the castle called His Grace's house, and His Grace is His Grace. The family name you need not trouble yourself with. It is not used in the servants' hall. He is only a private gentleman who chooses to be private." And she was gone. "Well, and so am I," thought Rosalind, finishing her coffee. She took her shawl and her bonnet and her stout boots and went down. The castle in daylight was a long, strong, plain-faced building of grey Cornish granite, settled upon the headland as though it had grown there. She passed out through the great hall, the falcon and gauntlet banners brighter by day, though still faded, through a low oak door into the cobbled court, through an arched passage, and out onto the headland itself. The wind caught her full in the face. It was a clean salt wind, not unkindly but very steady, and it flattened her cream shawl against her ribs and carried a small spray of taste onto her lips from the sea far below. She drew the shawl tighter and walked. The headland was bare turf and outcrop, set here and there with low grey stone walls for the sheep. The gulls wheeled and cried. Once a raven crossed the path ahead of her on long black wings and did not heed her at all. She walked as far as the old Coast Guard wall and stood a long moment with her gloved hands folded upon the top of it, looking out. The Atlantic went on forever. The cliffs beneath her fell 200 feet to a narrow shingle cove, where the sea broke white and sighed back green. North, along the coast, the next headland, and the next, thrust their black shoulders into the morning. There was no ship, no sail. There was only the wind and the sea and the thin calling of the gulls. I might be the only soul in England, she thought. It is not an unpleasant thought. She turned back at last, her cheeks pinked by the cold, her cream shawl grey with salt spray. The castle stood solemn and square upon its granite, lit by the pale morning sun, the 5 chimneys she had counted from her window, quiet against the sky. Somewhere within that grey weight, a man was waiting for her to read to him at 8 o'clock. The rest of the day passed kindly and without event. She unpacked her trunk into the oak press, the 2 gowns, the linen, the music books, the worn cowper, her mother's diary. She walked the long gallery and looked at the family portraits, of whose subjects she knew none of the names. She took a cup of tea in the housekeeper's pantry at 4, because Mrs. Pendarves insisted, and answered, truly and briefly, a few kind questions about her people. At 7:30 she dressed again carefully, the slate-grey muslin, the fichu smoothed afresh, silver cross, cream cashmere for the cold of the corridors, and sat upon the edge of the narrow bed, hands folded, listening. At 7 minutes before 8, the step came. Mrs. Pendarves, in evening bombazine, curtsied in the doorway. "If you are ready, Miss Ashton." They went down by the winding stone stair, along the flagged corridor, through the great hall, along the long gallery where the candles had been lit in their brackets. At the far end stood a heavy oak door with an iron latch. Mrs. Pendarves lifted the latch, opened the door, stood aside, and said quite low, "Miss Ashton, Your Grace." Rosalind stepped in. The library took her breath. It was a long, deep room, 2 stories under a plastered, vaulted ceiling, with tall, narrow-leaded windows upon the seaward wall, and every other wall lined floor to ceiling with dark oak shelving. 11,000 volumes, Mr. Trewin had said, and she believed it now. The shelves ran on, tooled calf and morocco and vellum, gilt titles catching the candlelight. A pair of library ladders upon brass wheels stood at opposite ends. The air smelt warmly of beeswax, of old leather, of the sea-coal fire burning at the far end in a great hearth of carved stone. 2 deep green leather wing-back chairs were drawn toward that fire. A small round side table stood between them, bearing a decanter of Madeira amber in the firelight, 2 small crystal glasses, and 3 books in a neat pile. An ebony walking stick with a silver knob leaned against the arm of the nearer chair. A lamp had been lit for her upon a reading stand beside the further chair. The man in the nearer chair rose as she came in. He rose with the deliberate care of one who has learned the geometry of a room by touch, one hand a moment upon the chair back. He was very tall, 6 foot and 2 inches at least, and carried his height well, though his plain black, superfine tailcoat hung a little loose at the shoulders of a man who had eaten too little for too long. His waistcoat was black, his white linen shirt stood high at the throat and open with no cravat at all. His trousers were charcoal grey, his hessians polished to a quiet shine. His hair was thick chestnut brown, wavy, too long by any town standard. It brushed his collar, and one lock fell across the high brow. There was a faint shadow of a day's stubble at the jaw. His eyes were large, long-lashed, pale grey blue, and clouded. They were fixed upon nothing, and yet the shape of them was gentle, unhurried, serious. At the outer edge of the right eyebrow, following the line down to the temple, ran a pale silver thread of a long-healed mark. Long-healed only. No redness, no injury. A small closed record of something that had been and was done. He bowed to her gravely. He did not offer his hand. He could not see to find hers, and she saw, quite plainly, that he knew it, and would not embarrass either of them by pretending otherwise. "Miss Ashton." His voice was a deep, quiet baritone, slightly roughened in the lower register. "You will sit, I hope, in the other chair. Mrs. Pendarves will have lit the lamp for you. I do not require it myself." Thank you, Your Grace. She sat. Her skirt settled against the deep green leather. She could hear, faintly, the wind moving in the chimney of the great hearth and the long sigh of the Atlantic against the leaded windows behind her. "There are 3 books upon the table," he said. "You will oblige me by choosing as you like." She looked at them. Cowper's Task, bound in dark blue calf, Scott's Marmion in green, the first volume of Hume's History of England in plain brown. The Cowper is dangerous, she thought. It is too gentle, too intimate. The Scott is bright, but it is verse, and verse is nearly music, and I had rather not sing to him tonight. Her hand hesitated. It settled upon the Hume. "I shall begin with Mr. Hume, Your Grace, if it is agreeable." "It is quite agreeable, Miss Ashton." "Wherever you please." She opened the volume, found the chapter upon the early Saxon kings, glanced at the first paragraph, measured, sober, a little dry, and drew her breath and began. She read in her warm, low contralto, quietly, without haste or flourish, shaping the long sentences as her music mistress had taught her to shape long phrases. She gave Hume his commas and his semicolons. She did not dramatize. Her Yorkshire softening lay at the back of the vowels, a slightly rounder a, a slightly longer o, but she did not hide it. She had no hiding left. He sat with his head turned very slightly away from her, toward the fire he could not see. His right hand rested upon the silver top of the ebony stick. His expression did not change. He did not move. Once a sea coal fell in the hearth with a small red whisper, and he did not turn. Only each time she drew breath at the end of a long sentence, she felt, rather than saw, a very small stillness in him, as though he were listening with more than his ears. She read 40 minutes. The case clock struck the quarters very faintly. When the hand approached the hour, she brought the passage to a natural close at the end of a paragraph, closed the volume, and laid it in her lap. The fire whispered. The sea sighed against the leaded glass. "Thank you, Miss Ashton," said the Duke quietly. 9 o'clock tomorrow, if it would be agreeable." "It would, Your Grace." She rose. She curtsied. He did not see the curtsy. She made it all the same. She walked out of the library with the even step her music mistress had drilled into her, and the oak door closed softly behind her. Only in the cold of the gallery, with her hand on the wall, did she allow herself one long, slow breath. The next morning, she woke knowing his voice already. I do not require it myself, and was a little annoyed with herself for it. The pattern settled quickly, as patterns do. At 7 minutes before the hour each evening, Mrs. Pendarves came to the arched door. At 8, Rosalind stepped into the library, curtsied unseen, and took her place in the further chair. She read Hume, cautious Hume, colourless Hume, Hume who could not betray her. She read 40 minutes. He thanked her. She curtsied. She went away. The lamp was lit for her each night upon its stand. The decanter of Madeira and the 2 small crystal glasses stood upon the side table, and neither of them touched either. On the 3rd evening, within a page of her beginning, she came to a Latin tag, a phrase Hume had pressed into the narrative without translation, and she read it, in all innocence and in the London pronunciation she had been taught, a little wrong. She heard quite plainly a small breath from the other chair. "Pari passu, Miss Ashton." His voice was gentle, unhurried, faintly touched with something that might in another man have been a smile. With equal step. The colour went up her cheeks in a warm, slow climb. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. It is not an offence. The tag is an awkward one. Hume is fond of them." "Pari passu," she repeated obediently, getting it right this time. "Just so." She went on with the paragraph, her voice perfectly steady. But under the steady voice her mind was quick and a little humbled. "He reads Latin," she thought. "Of course he reads Latin. He reads his Latin as I read my French. Only I did not know it of him. I have known nothing of him." And in her narrow bed that night, she resolved to try harder, to pronounce each unfamiliar word in her head before she spoke it aloud, to give him no occasion to correct her again. It was not that she feared the correction. It was that she could not bear, to her own surprise, to disappoint him. On day 4, going along the stone gallery toward the library at 7:45, she met a young man coming the other way. He stopped at once, and bowed, and did not stare. He was perhaps 26, of middle height, wiry and quick. His close-cropped, dark auburn hair was in the regimental cut. His eyes were a frank, clear hazel, his skin still faintly sun-browned from some other country's sun. He wore a plain dark blue undress coat of the 7th Light Dragoons, without epaulets, without any touch of gold, a plain white waistcoat, white breeches, black top boots polished to a hard gloss. "Miss Ashton, I believe," he said. "Forgive me. I would not accost you in a passage, but I have been hoping to make my bow. Courtney, Lieutenant James Courtney. I am His Grace's aide, Miss Ashton, and his friend. Ask me if anything should be wanting." She curtsied. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I have everything I want. You are very kind." "It is not kindness. It is my office. I am glad you are come." He smiled, a quick, open smile, and stepped aside to let her pass, and went on his way. She heard his boot heels ring down the corridor behind her and thought, "Irish, I fancy. Peninsular sun." "A friend," he said. "There is a friend in the house." And it warmed her unreasonably as she laid her hand upon the latch of the library door. On the afternoon of the 5th day, returning a borrowed needle to Mrs. Pendarves, she paused at the open door of the housekeeper's pantry. Mrs. Pendarves sat at her little writing table, making out an order for flour, silver-rimmed reading glasses low on her nose, a cup of tea at her elbow. She looked up and beckoned Rosalind in. The pantry was small and warm, a blue and white dresser hung with china, a jar of dried lavender on the sill, a kettle murmuring on the hob. They spoke of small things, of the flour, of a keg of butter from the home farm, of the Reverend Penrose who was to dine with His Grace that evening. And then Mrs. Pendarves, with no change of voice, remarked, "Her Ladyship at Penhale has sent down a basket of hothouse pears. I shall return the basket with the thanks, of course, but the pears, well, His Grace does not care for them." "Her Ladyship at Penhale?" said Rosalind mildly. Mrs. Pendarves's warm, pale blue eyes came up from her order list, brisk and private and not altogether friendly. "Lady Clarissa Penhale, my dear, of Penhale Court, the neighbouring estate. A widow these 4 years." She added with a small dryness that surprised Rosalind, "Her Ladyship has long been accustomed to interest herself in Harlow affairs. We return her baskets. We do not seek her advice." She dipped her pen, and the matter was closed. Rosalind drank her tea, and kept her countenance. So, there is a neighbour whose interest is not welcome. Well, I am a reader. It is none of my concern. The evenings went on. She read Hume. Always Hume. She had begun to know the library, the cedar-scented drawer where the tapers were kept, the faint creak of the 3rd floorboard from the fireside, the way the Atlantic wind came against the leaded windows on nights when it was easterly and sang in the chimney of the great hearth on nights when it was southerly. And she had begun, though she did not wish to own it, to know him. The grave mouth that did not smile, the faint shadow of stubble at the jaw, the one chestnut lock that fell across the brow, the way he held very still while she read, his right hand upon the ebony, his head turned just slightly away. She noticed, too, and was foolishly glad to notice, that on the morning of day 5, Mrs. Pendarves had said, in passing, that His Grace had permitted his man to shave him properly. And when Rosalind came into the library that evening, the shadow of stubble was gone, and the clean line of his jaw showed unmarked, and something in the grave face had eased by a very small degree. He is not yet 30, she thought, reading Hume, watching him out of the corner of her eye, while her voice gave him the dry Saxon kings, and he is sitting as still as a monument. It is a wrong thing, that a young man should sit so still. She did not quite know what she meant by wrong. She only knew that she had begun to mind it. On the evening of day 6, she finished her Hume at 8:40 past the hour and closed the book and laid it in her lap. He thanked her, as he thanked her every evening. She rose. She curtsied unseen. She turned to go. Her eye, as she turned, fell upon the side table. The decanter stood. The 2 small crystal glasses stood. The 3 volumes stood as they had stood for 6 nights. Cowper, Scott, Hume. But beside them, sat a little apart, lay a 4th book that had not been there the night before. A plain dark blue calf volume. Cowper's Task. It was not the library's Cowper, which stood untouched in its pile. This one was a little worn, softer at the spine. It lay open, face down upon the table to keep its place. She did not look at the page. She walked out of the library with her usual even step. The oak door closed behind her. She went up the long gallery in the candlelight, up the winding stair, into her tower room, and closed the arched door, and stood a moment with her back against it. A 4th book. Cowper. Left out. The Reverend Penrose, she remembered, had dined with His Grace the evening before. Mrs. Pendarves had mentioned it across the tea. The vicar had dined, and today was the next day, and the book was a new thing upon the table. Perhaps a servant had moved it. Perhaps His Grace had set it there himself, reaching along the shelf by memory. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. And yet she could not quite let it alone. She drew the cream cashmere tighter, crossed to the deep-set window, and looked out over the moonlit headland, where the Atlantic broke silver along the black cliffs, and turned the fact over in her mind. Cowper. Opened. Left for her to find. She did not know yet to what page the book was opened, nor what the page would say. She knew only that something in the careful ordering of her careful evenings had moved 1/4 of an inch, and that, by some instinct she could not name, it had moved toward her. The sea thudded against the cliffs below the tower. She stood a long while at the window, before she turned away to bank her fire. The morning of the 7th day broke clear and cold, with a thin winter sun laid in long bars across the flagstones of the great hall. Rosalind, drawing back the linen curtain in her tower room, looked down upon a headland rimed lightly with frost, and thought the world beyond the leaded glass very still. She did not know, as she dressed in her slate-grey muslin and pinned her honey-gold hair into its smooth, low chignon, that at that same hour the Reverend Arthur Penrose was setting out from the vicarage in Harlow village with a small, dark blue volume tucked beneath his arm. The old vicar climbed the cliff path with the slow, measured step of a man of 68. His soft, silver-white hair, combed back, showed beneath his plain black clerical hat. His gentle, watery blue eyes behind the small, silver-rimmed spectacles watered a little in the wind. His thin, parchment-fair skin was flushed at the cheekbones from the climb. Beneath the plain black clerical coat, the white collar band was neat. The small silver crucifix on its black silk cord lay warm against his waistcoat. He was admitted at the great door and walked himself along the long gallery to the heavy oak door at the end. Benedict rose from the deep green leather wingback as the latch lifted. He stood very tall, in plain black superfine tailcoat and charcoal trousers, the white shirt open at the throat, the ebony stick loosely in his right hand. His chestnut-brown hair fell in the one lock across the high brow. His pale grey-blue eyes, clouded and gentle in shape, were turned toward the sound of the door. "Arthur, you are welcome." "Benedict, my dear boy." The old man laid his thin, fair hand lightly upon the Duke's forearm. He had christened him in '83, and was one of the few men in England who might use that hand and that name. They settled into the two wing-back chairs. A sea-coal fire burned softly in the great hearth. The Atlantic wind moved high in the chimney. Penrose laid the dark blue calf volume upon the side table, a little apart from the others. It was Cowper's task, his own copy, softer at the spine from long use, a folded paper marking a place within. "I have brought you my Cowper," said the vicar gently. "It has a passage in the 6th book that I have been meaning to read to you, and have not. I think perhaps I shall not read it after all. I shall leave it here, and if it please you, you may find another voice to read it instead." Benedict's mouth moved by a fraction. It was nearer a smile than had been upon his face in many days. "You are a tactful man, Arthur. I am an old one, which is not always the same thing." Penrose polished his spectacles with a linen handkerchief. "I shall say a little more than I ought, and you shall forgive me because I baptized you. Music has always had a consolation for the afflicted. A voice reading aloud is only another form of music, the slower kind, perhaps, but it is of the same country. You have been listening to a voice this week, I think." Benedict's hand tightened very slightly upon the silver knob of the stick. "I only say, do not be ashamed to be consoled. It is not a failing in a brave man to accept consolation. It is what consolation is for." A sea-coal fell with a small red whisper. "I have not been ashamed, Arthur," said Benedict at last. "I have only been uncertain whether a man is permitted to hope twice in one lifetime." The old vicar looked at him a long moment and did not answer that directly. He only laid his hand a moment upon the dark blue calf of the book. "I shall leave the task on the side table. The marker is at book 6. I think you will find Cowper has anticipated you." He rose, stiff in the knees, and Benedict rose with him. Penrose laid his hand once more upon the tall man's forearm, turned, and walked himself out. Benedict stood a long time beside the chair, and at length sat and laid his hand flat upon the dark blue calf of the book, and ran his thumb once along its worn spine and let it lie. In the east tower, Rosalind had tied her black straw bonnet under her chin and gone down the cliff path to the village upon a small practical errand, a skein of white thread for the mending of her fichu. Harlow village lay at the foot of the cliff, a lane of whitewashed cottages facing the small harbour. The thin, late February sun lay warm upon the slate roofs. Fishermen at an upturned boat touched their caps to the young lady in grey and cream. A woman shelling peas nodded gravely. A small child stared from a doorstep. Rosalind smiled, and the child, after much consideration, smiled back. Mrs. Polglace at the haberdasher's produced a skein of good white cotton, took the coin, wrapped the thread in brown paper. Coming back up the lane, she paused at the lych gate of the parish church, St. Morgan's, a small whitewashed building of ancient stone, its narrow lancet windows catching the pale sun, its low square tower weathered by 400 winters of Atlantic salt. She did not go in. She only stood a moment with her gloved hands upon the iron gate. She climbed the cliff path home in the late February sun, her cream shawl drawn close. She mended the fichu by the window, and when the gallery clock struck 7, she smoothed the fichu back into place at the neck of the slate-grey muslin, set the small silver cross straight upon its black silk cord, drew the cream cashmere over her shoulders, and sat upon the edge of her bed, with her hands folded, listening. At 7 minutes before 8, the step came. Mrs. Pendarves, in black evening bombazine, curtsied at the arched door. They went down together. Stone stair, flagged corridor, great hall, long gallery where the candles had been lit. At the oak door, Mrs. Pendarves lifted the iron latch, stood aside, and said quite low, "Miss Ashton, Your Grace." Rosalind stepped in. The library was as it always was, the vaulted ceiling, the dark oak shelving, rank on rank, the tall leaded windows at the seaward wall, the sea-coal fire murmuring in the great carved hearth, the reading lamp lit for her upon its stand. But Hume was not on the side table. Hume had been set aside. She saw the plain brown spine resting upon the shelf behind the chair. The Scott, too, had been moved. Only Cowper's task, the vicar's Cowper, softer at the spine, lay open upon the table, face up now, at a page with a folded paper marker laid beside it. Benedict rose as she came in. He stood by the deep green leather chair, very tall, one hand a moment upon the chair back, the ebony stick leaning against the arm. His pale grey-blue eyes were turned toward the sound of her step. "Miss Ashton." "Your Grace. The vicar has left a passage. I should be obliged if you would read it." She curtsied unseen, came to the further chair, settled her skirts against the deep green leather, and drew the open book toward her. The marker lay at the 6th book of the task. The page was the winter evening by the fireside. She drew her breath. She began. "Now stir the fire, and close the shutters fast, slash, let fall the curtains, wheel the sofa round, slash, and, while the bubbling and loud hissing urn throws up a steamy column, and the cups, that cheer but not inebriate, wait on each, so let us welcome peaceful evening in." Her voice filled the long, quiet room. There was no Hume to restrain it tonight, no dry Saxon kings to make a shell around the sound of her. She was only a woman reading Cowper by the fire, and her voice was what it had always been, warm, low, unconsciously musical, with a slight northern softening at the back of the vowels. She read on, into the lines where Cowper blesses the hearth and the closed-in hour against the wind without. She had not looked at Benedict since she had begun. She did not need to. Something in the quality of his listening had changed, as though a man at a window had turned his head a quarter-inch toward a sound behind him in the room. She came to the passage Cowper gives to the book and the voice together. She read, "Books, dreams are each a world, and books we know, slash, are a substantial world, both pure and good. Round these with tendrils strong as flesh and blood, our pastime and our happiness will grow." On the fourth movement of the passage, where Cowper brings the voice and the hearth and the evening together in one quiet assurance, Benedict rose. He did not rise quickly. He rose as a tall man rises who has been sitting still a long time, one hand a moment upon the chair arm, the other closing hard upon the silver knob of the ebony stick. His pale grey-blue eyes were fixed upon nothing, but the whole of his face had changed. The grave mouth was only very still, as though he dared not move it. His knuckles upon the silver knob were white. Rosalind, at the edge of her attention, saw him rise, and her voice did not falter. She read to the end of the movement. The bracket clock ticked once on the far shelf. A sea-coal shifted in the hearth. The Atlantic wind moved against the leaded windows behind her. "Will you read me the next lines again, Miss Ashton?" he said very quietly, "if you would." She drew her breath, laid her finger upon the line where she had begun, and read them again, the same lines in the same warm, low contralto, and he did not sit down. He stood beside the chair, the ebony stick gripped in his right hand, his whole tall body gone very still, and she read. When she finished, he did not speak at once. He turned his head toward her, very slowly, as a man turns his head toward the source of a sound he's been listening for a long time. "I know your voice," he said. The words came so quietly that for a moment she thought she had not heard rightly. "I have been trying to find you for 4 years. Lady Eversleigh's, May the 11th, 1808. You sang an aria of Handel's from behind a folding screen. Tell me I have not gone mad." The book slipped from Rosalind's hand. It fell against the green leather, slid down her skirt, struck the carpet with a soft, heavy thump, and lay open, face down, upon the hearthrug. She did not stoop for it. Her hand went to her throat, where the small silver cross lay against the white lace of the fichu. She was very cold in her hands, and very hot at her cheekbones, and the library had gone so still that she could hear her own pulse. She tried to deny it. She opened her mouth. The words did not come. She sat frozen in the deep green leather chair in her slate-grey muslin, her cream cashmere fallen a little from one shoulder, and said nothing at all. He heard the silence. "I do not ask for your real name tonight," he said, still turned toward the chair where she sat. "I do not ask anything of you that you do not wish to give. I only ask this: tell me whether I am mistaken." The wind moved in the chimney. The fire whispered. The bracket clock ticked once and once again. She drew a long, slow breath that shook at the end of it. "Your Grace," she said, and her warm, low voice was not quite steady. Yes. I sang at Lady Eversleigh's in May, 1808. The aria was Lascia Ch'io Pianga." She heard him not move. "I am not called Ashton. Ashton was my mother's name. I have used it because my cousin Sir Percy Marlowe has dispossessed me, and I needed a post, and I could not afford the name of Marlowe to follow me into service." Her hand tightened upon the small silver cross. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not know whose house I entered." He sat down very carefully, both hands a moment upon the chair arms as he lowered himself. When he spoke, his deep, quiet baritone was a little roughened in the lower register. "Miss Marlowe." She could not answer him. "I wrote you a letter the next morning," he said. "It was delivered to the wrong house. I have been trying to find you since." The fire whispered. The sea sighed against the leaded windows. For a long, quiet minute, neither of them spoke. At length he drew a slow breath and began. "There was a concert at Lady Eversleigh's in Manchester Square on Thursday, the 11th of May, 1808. A subscription thing for some charity. I was in regimentals, the 7th Light Dragoons, a captain. I was 24. At the end of the evening, a daughter of the house arranged a folding screen across the corner of the drawing-room to spare the shyness of some young lady I did not know, and asked her friend to sing one aria from behind it. The young lady sang Lascia Ch'io Pianga. I never saw her face. His hand rested upon the silver knob of the stick. I went home that night and could not sleep. In the morning I wrote a letter. It was not a wise letter. I was young. I wrote to the young lady who sang Handel from behind the screen at Lady Eversleigh's Thursday last. I sealed it with my regimental signet and gave it to a footman to carry to the Eversleigh's house for forwarding. The footman delivered it by an honest mistake to the Eversleigh's neighbours, a family called Thorpe. A maid put it upon a salver. Some gentleman of the house pocketed it and mislaid it. It was never returned and never sent on. I learned of the error much later. Rosalind's hand had not left the silver cross. 2 months after the concert, I was ordered out to join Wellington on the peninsula. I was 3 years there. On the 6th of April, 1811, we were at the storming of Badajoz. There was a French shell burst near me, a flash, and the darkness afterwards. That was all. The darkness did not lift. He said it plainly, as one relates a fact of weather. I was invalided home. My elder brother William died of typhus the following October. I inherited the dukedom, came down to Cornwall, and have been here ever since. He turned his head a little, and the firelight caught the pale silver thread of the long-healed mark at the outer edge of his right eyebrow. In all that time I have been trying, first idly, through friends in London, then with a steadier persistence through my solicitor, to find the young woman who had sung one aria behind a folding screen at Lady Eversley's. We had the guest list. There were 87 ladies present. None of them was you. It had become a habit of inquiry with me, a small ghost of a hope. I was almost ashamed, latterly, to still carry it. When Mrs. Pendarves and Reverend Penrose proposed the reading post a month ago, I agreed listlessly. I did not care whether the reader came or not. And then on the first evening, a voice walked in through that door and gave me Hume of all things, and I sat very still, because something in the timbre of it had reminded me of a Handel aria 4 years ago. I told myself the ear was playing me tricks. On the second evening I thought it again, and the third, and the fourth. Tonight the vicar brought his Cowper, and I thought, if there is anything at all in what I have been thinking, Cowper will speak for me and I shall know. And you read, Miss Marlowe. And I knew. The fire whispered. The sea moved against the leaded windows. The bracket clock struck the quarter, very faintly, and neither of them turned. "Will you tell me now," he said, "how you came to be the young woman in the Morning Post?" And so she told him. She told him of her uncle Sir Edward in the tall Bloomsbury house, the easy kind man who had taken her in at 17, of Sir Edward's death in September, of Sir Percy Marlowe arriving 3 weeks afterwards with a forged codicil that gave him the house and the consols, and left Rosalind nothing but a small settlement of her mother's she could not touch until she married or turned 25. She told him of the January morning upon which Sir Percy had come into the sitting-room, and had told her with his permanent half-smile that she would do better to look for a post, that the house was his now, that he would give her a fortnight. She told him of the £40 in banknotes, the 3 days at a Bloomsbury lodging-house, the Morning Post spread upon the table of a chop-house in Holborn, the advertisement, the stagecoach west. She told him why she had given her mother's name. She told him she had only ever heard of Captain Benedict Harrington of the 7th Dragoons, and had never met him, and that the late Duke William had died before she had been brought out. She told him, last of all, that she was sorry for the shape of the deception, though she could not be sorry for its necessity. He had listened in perfect stillness. When she had finished, he did not answer at once. Then he said, very gently, "Miss Marlowe, you gave a false name because you were a gentlewoman in peril. I should have been ashamed of any friend of this house who judged you for it. I am not one of them. Keep your mother's name as long as you choose. It was a good name, and you wear it with grace." She did not trust her voice. She inclined her head, which he could not see, and then, because he could not see it, said aloud, quite low, "Thank you, Your Grace." Neither of them spoke for a long while after that. The Cowper lay upon the hearth-rug where the book had fallen. At length Benedict reached forward and down with his long, careful hand, and found it, and lifted it, and laid it closed upon the side-table. His thumb rested a moment upon the worn spine. He did not open it again. They sat in the firelight. The bracket clock ticked quietly. The Atlantic wind moved steadily against the leaded windows of the library, a long, low breath off the sea. Rosalind did not rise to go. He did not ask her to. She sat in her slate-grey muslin, her cream cashmere drawn close, her hand lying loosely against the small silver cross at her throat. He sat with his clouded, pale grey-blue eyes fixed upon nothing. At last she rose. He heard her rise. He stood as she stood, the ebony stick taken up in his right hand, and bowed gravely in her direction. She curtsied, and he could not see the curtsy, and she made it all the same. "Good night, Your Grace," "Good night, Miss Marlowe." She walked out of the library with her even step, the oak door closed softly behind her. She went along the long gallery in the candlelight, up the winding stone stair, into her tower room, and shut the arched door, and stood a long moment with her back against it. The fire in her grate had burned very low. She did not build it up. She unpinned her honey-gold hair and let it fall to the middle of her back. She drew the rush-seated chair to the deep-set window and sat down in her slate-grey muslin. Her mother's travel diary lay upon the writing desk. She did not reach for it. She did not write anything at all that night. The moon was high over the headland, the sea beneath the cliffs in long bars of silver and black. "I know your voice," he had said. "I have been trying to find you for 4 years." The fire sank to a dim red, sank further, went out. She drew the cream cashmere around her shoulders. She thought of a folding screen in a drawing room in Manchester Square, and a young captain she had never seen, and a letter she had never had, and of a tall, quiet man by a fire in a Cornish library who had said to her, very gently, "Keep your mother's name as long as you choose." Some while before dawn, the wind dropped. The first grey of morning came up out of the east over the Atlantic, long and slow and cold, and turned at last to the clean pale grey of a Cornish February daybreak. She was still sitting in the chair by the window when it came. She knew only that somewhere in the library below, a man whom she had begun, without meaning to know, was sitting up still in the green leather chair, with his hand upon the worn spine of a cowper, waiting for the same grey dawn. The grey dawn over Harlow Headland found Rosalind still in the rush-seated chair by the window of her tower room, the cream cashmere shawl about her shoulders, her honey-gold hair loose to the middle of her back. She had not slept. She had sat in the deep-set window for 5 or 6 hours, her mind going round and round, not fevered, only very wide awake. She had learned in one movement of the evening 3 things she could not put down. That the tall, silent man in the library had been the young captain behind a folding screen 4 summers ago, that he had written her a letter, that he had been trying for 4 years to find her. She did not weep. She only watched the east go from black to pewter to the thin, clean grey of a Cornish February daybreak. At 7 she rose, washed at the basin, and dressed with her ordinary care. The slate-grey muslin, the white lace fichu, the small silver cross on its black silk cord, pinned her hair into its smooth, low chignon, and drew the cream cashmere about her shoulders. The house had changed. Mrs. Pendarvis met her at the foot of the tower stair, and dropped a small particular curtsy Rosalind had not seen before. "Good morning, miss. His Grace asks that you will take your breakfast in the small breakfast room this morning. It overlooks the walled garden. And if you will excuse me, miss, His Grace has asked by Lieutenant Courtney that your trunk be moved from the east tower into the primrose room in the south wing by this afternoon. I shall have the fire lit there directly." The pale blue eyes smiled with their faint crow's feet. "I have been hoping to put you in the primrose since the night you came." Rosalind felt the colour come and go. "Mrs. Pendarvis, you are very kind, but I cannot. It is too much. The east tower has been quite sufficient." "I shall tell His Grace what you have said, miss," said the housekeeper calmly, and went away. Lieutenant Courtney waited at the end of the long gallery, in his plain dark blue undress coat of the 7th Light Dragoons, his close-cropped dark auburn hair brushed neatly, his frank hazel eyes respectful. He bowed as to a gentlewoman. The small breakfast room in the south wing was a square-panelled room with a bow window and a round mahogany table laid for one, a single hothouse violet in a glass. The bow window looked down upon the walled garden, where the first narcissi were breaking through a thin skin of frost, their green spears tipped already with the merest yellow. Courtney stood at a discreet distance beside the sideboard and said nothing until she laid her napkin aside. "Miss Marlowe, His Grace asked me to say a further word to you, if you would hear it." "Of course, Lieutenant. He says," and these were his exact words, for he made me repeat them back, "Miss Marlowe, I owe you 4 years of quiet reparation. You will permit me to begin with a proper chamber and a proper chair at a proper table. Beyond that I shall presume nothing." Rosalind looked down at her folded hands. She drew in her breath, slowly, and let it out. She found that she was, very faintly, smiling. "Lieutenant Courtney, will you tell His Grace that I accept the Primrose Room with grateful thanks, and that I shall be honoured to dine at the proper table, and that I understand what he has said, and what he has not said, and that I am content with both?" A grave small smile touched the corner of Courtney's wide Irish mouth. "I shall tell him, miss." She did not see Benedict that morning. Mrs. Pendarves told her afterwards that he had dispatched an express rider to Bath, carrying a sealed letter of 3 close-written pages to his aunt, the Dowager Lady Charlotte Harrington, requesting her immediate presence at Harlow Castle as chaperone to a young gentlewoman of his house. The Primrose Room was on the south side, 2 doors from the head of the great staircase. It had pale yellow silk hangings to its 4-poster, a writing desk of polished walnut under the window, a chintz easy-chair beside the hearth, and a bow window over the walled garden. The fire was new lit. A single-cut narcissus stood in a glass upon the desk. Rosalind laid her mother's travel diary upon the walnut desk and stood a long moment at the window, and thought she had not, in 7 weeks, stood so quietly in so kind a room. Dinner was at 6. She had changed into the high-waisted, soft, dove-blue silk evening gown with short puff sleeves and narrow white lace trim at the hem, the single strand of small pearls at her throat, her honey-gold hair dressed low with one small white silk ribbon. She came down to the green-panelled dining parlour, lit by sea-coal firelight and candlelight. Benedict stood as she was announced, beside his chair at the head of the oak table, very tall in a black, superfine tailcoat, a black silk waistcoat, and, for the first time since she had known him, a white cravat, properly tied, its folds plain but neat, against the high collar of a fresh white shirt. His chestnut hair had been brushed back. The one lock that always fell across his high brow fell now in a more orderly way, as though a valet's hand had been allowed to trouble it for the first time in many months. His pale, grey-blue, clouded eyes were turned toward her step. "Miss Marlowe, you are welcome at my table. Your Grace." Courtney sat opposite her in a plain, dark civilian coat. Reverend Penrose sat at the 4th place, the small silver crucifix at his throat catching the light. The talk was quiet, grave, kind. Benedict said little, but listened with his whole attention. And when Rosalind said that she thought Cowper had loved most the hour after the candles were lit, he answered her gravely, "So do I, Miss Marlowe. I have more and more believed so." Afterwards they went into the library. Rosalind took the Cowper from the side table and read a short passage of the 5th book by Benedict's choice. A little of the winter walk at noon, nothing tender. His grave mouth moved once or twice, nearer a smile than it had been. They sat in the firelight afterwards, and the old hard silence of a man who would not be comforted was no longer between them. The next 3 days went evenly. Rosalind read to Benedict for an hour in the forenoon and an hour after dinner. She walked in the walled garden at noon. She dined at 6 at the proper table. Benedict did not speak of Lady Eversleigh's, or of a folding screen, or of a letter misdirected in May of 1808. He was giving her time. On the 4th day, a little before noon, a plain post chaise rolled under the gatehouse archway and drew up at the great door. The Dowager Lady, Charlotte Harrington stepped down in a travelling cloak of dark grey wool over her high-waisted slate-grey silk widow's half-mourning. She was of medium height, slim, 54 years of age, with shrewd, warm brown eyes in a finely lined fair face and a soft, smiling mouth. A white lace fichu lay at her throat, a small jet cross on a black silk cord at her breast, a plain gold wedding ring on her left hand. A widow's cap of white lace was drawn over her neat coronet of silver-brown hair. She came briskly up the steps. Benedict was in the hall on Courtney's arm. Rosalind, summoned by Mrs. Pendarves, had come down in her slate-grey muslin and cream cashmere. Lady Charlotte embraced her nephew, held him a moment at arm's length, and said quite low, "Benedict, my dear, you have your face on again." Then she turned and took Rosalind's measure in one quick, shrewd glance. "My dear." Lady Charlotte crossed the flagstones, set her gloved hands upon Rosalind's arms, and drew her into a brief, fierce, unfussed hug. "My dear, my nephew has written me 3 pages of a man who has been waiting for you for 4 years. You will allow me to be very glad. I have installed myself in the rose chamber next to your primrose. Ring for me at any hour, my love, and at any hour at all I shall come." Rosalind's sea-grey eyes blurred for 1 second. She inclined her head and said in her warm, low voice, "Lady Charlotte, you are very kind. I am very useful, which is not always the same thing." She became, that afternoon, Rosalind's staunchest ally, and remained so. The 5th day since the recognition, the 12th since Rosalind had come up the cliff path with her trunk, was a bright, cold afternoon of thin, high cloud. At 3 o'clock, a crimson-lacquered barouche, drawn by a handsome pair of glossy black horses with silver-buckled harness, came up the cliff road and drew up at the great door. Within it sat Lady Clarissa Penhale, widow of the late Lord Penhale of Penhale Court, 2 valleys eastward along the coast. She had learned, from her lady's maid, whose elder sister was under cook at Harlow, that a change had come over the master of the castle, and she had determined, with her handsome head held high, to pay a call. She was 26, tall at 5 feet 8, statuesque. Her glossy jet-black hair was dressed in a fashionable Grecian coronet with a pair of black ostrich plumes curling above. Her glittering dark brown, heavy-lidded eyes were cold. Her pale alabaster skin was carefully powdered. Her full red mouth was a shade too firm to be called beautiful. She wore a high-waisted crimson silk evening gown with short puff sleeves and a broad gold Greek key embroidery at the hem. A gown out of season and out of hour for a country call at 3 of the afternoon, and chosen for that very reason. Long white kid gloves were drawn up above her elbows. A ruby and diamond parure, necklace, earrings and bandeau caught the thin daylight at her throat and brow. A black satin reticule hung from her wrist. She let herself be shown into the pale green drawing-room. Lady Charlotte received her there, standing upon the hearthrug in her slate-grey silk, her white lace widow's cap as neat as an iron flag. Rosalind, on Lady Charlotte's direction, stood a little to one side of the fireplace in her slate-grey muslin and white fichu. The working dress, not the dove-blue silk, Lady Charlotte had been perfectly clear upon the point. Clarissa swept in. She kissed Lady Charlotte's cheek with the little brushing pretence of a kiss. Lady Charlotte offered her cheek with iron civility and did not return the gesture. Then the glittering dark brown eyes went to the young woman at the hearth. Clarissa did not offer her hand. She extended a single long-gloved finger, one finger only, in Rosalind's direction, as one might indicate a piece of furniture to a footman, and said with a full sweet smile, "How charming! The companion, I apprehend. You have such a pleasant reading voice, I am told. The servants' hall speaks of nothing else. The heavy-lidded eyes made one slow, deliberate sweep from the crown of Rosalind's smooth, low chignon to the hem of her slate-grey muslin, and back again. Rosalind did not colour. She had been trained, at her late uncle's table, to hold her countenance against sharper tongues than this. She only inclined her head the civil quarter-inch, and said in her warm, low voice, "Lady Clarissa." Lady Charlotte stepped between them with beautiful iron civility. "My niece by affection, Miss Rosalind Marlowe of Bloomsbury. The late Sir Edward Marlowe was her uncle. You are acquainted, I think, with the Marlowes of Yorkshire?" There was a small, perfect pause. Clarissa was not acquainted with the Marlowes of Yorkshire. She could not have named a single member of that branch if her parure had depended upon it. She was caught flat-footed, her plumes trembling very slightly, and her heavy-lidded eyes went for one unguarded second to the dowager's face, which returned her the look of a woman who had spent 40 years in the drawing-rooms of Bath, and was not in the least afraid of her. "Ah," said Clarissa, recovering with her practised smoothness. "The Yorkshire branch. Quite, quite," said Lady Charlotte. "Pray be seated, Lady Clarissa. Miss Marlowe, my love, will you pour?" Rosalind took her place behind the silver teapot with her steady hands and poured. Clarissa sat on the pale green silk sofa with a rustle of crimson, and took her cup with a fine indifference. The oak door opened then, and Benedict came in upon Lieutenant Courtney's arm. He was in the black, superfine tailcoat, and the black silk waistcoat, and the white cravat properly tied. His chestnut hair was brushed. He carried the ebony stick in his free right hand. His pale grey-blue, clouded eyes were lifted toward the room he could not see. Courtney placed him very precisely, and stepped aside. Benedict bowed in Clarissa's direction with perfect civility. "Lady Clarissa." "You are welcome." "Your Grace," said Clarissa, a warmer timbre in her voice than had hitherto been permitted it. "I am so glad, so very glad to see you receiving again. I cannot tell you how often—" Benedict did not answer her. He turned his dark head a little, found the direction of Rosalind's chair with the quiet sureness of a man learning her place in a room, and crossed the carpet without haste. He took the small chair beside hers. He did not seat himself opposite Clarissa. He spoke quietly, his grave mouth turned toward Rosalind, and said in his deep, soft baritone, "Miss Marlowe, I have been thinking of the passage you read last night. Cowper upon the winter walk at noon. There is a line upon the stillness of the deep snow under the fir trees that I should like to have again this evening, if it is not wearisome to you. I believe I had it imperfectly the first time. Of course, Your Grace, I shall find it. Thank you. It is the 27th line, I believe, though I may be a stanza wrong. 3 sentences." He did not address Lady Clarissa again. He laid one long, careful hand upon the arm of his chair, and turned his face toward Rosalind's, and sat there, his whole grave attention given to the woman at his side. Lady Charlotte, pouring her own cup with great tranquillity, asked Clarissa whether the camellias upon the south wall at Penhale Court had yet begun to blow, and Clarissa, who had gone very still upon the pale green silk sofa, replied shortly that they had not. 40 minutes passed. Benedict spoke twice more to Rosalind, once of a letter his solicitor had had out of London, once of a mare of Courtney's named Nell. He did not speak to Clarissa at all, though he inclined his head gravely whenever she addressed a remark to him. At the end of the 40 minutes, Rosalind, her colour recovered, her sea-grey eyes quite steady now, turned to their visitor and said with a gentle courtesy, "Lady Clarissa, we read again in the library this evening after dinner. If you would care to remain, we should be honoured." She said it without a trace of edge. It was the offered olive branch of a gentlewoman who would not return a slight. Clarissa's full red mouth made a small, tight smile. The heavy-lidded eyes glittered. "I should not dream of interrupting the lesson, my dear. Do carry on." She rose in a long rustle of crimson silk. Her plumes trembled. She made her short bow to Lady Charlotte, her still shorter bow to the Duke, and she did not bow to Rosalind at all. Courtney escorted her with perfect correctness to the great door and stood bareheaded upon the step until the barouche had turned under the gatehouse archway. In the barouche, half a mile along the cliff road toward Penhale Court, Lady Clarissa drew from her black satin reticule a small morocco-bound pocketbook with a silver pencil on a thin silver chain. She wrote, in her small, sharp hand, a careful draft of a letter to Mrs. Horatia Dalrymple of Half Moon Street, London, a cousin by marriage of Sir Percy Marlowe, and one of Clarissa's most useful correspondents, asking with polite, sisterly sweetness whether Mrs. Dalrymple could be so very kind as to tell her who this Miss Rosalind Marlowe of Bloomsbury might be, and whether her family was aware of her present situation at Harlow Castle, and where it seemed she had taken a post of some sort and was now dining with the Duke. She closed the pocketbook upon the draft and slipped it back within her reticule. She did not seal the letter that afternoon. She carried it home to Penhale Court and laid it in the drawer of her writing desk. At Harlow, dinner was quiet. Lady Charlotte kept the talk of tenants and weather and a small bath scandal, and let Rosalind recover her colour. Afterwards, in the library, they took their usual chairs. Lady Charlotte carried her embroidery frame to a chair at the far end of the long room, beside the tall leaded window, within perfect view, within perfect earshot, and yet at a delicate distance. She bent her silver-brown head above a half-worked spray of honeysuckle. Benedict, with his hand lightly upon the silver knob of the ebony stick, said quietly, "Clarissa Penhale will not return. She is not cruel, Rosalind. She is merely accustomed. She considered me a future husband while I was yet a captain, and she has not adjusted her view of the world to my eyes." Rosalind, her sea-grey eyes upon the fire, inclined her head. He paused. He turned his face slightly toward the direction he knew her chair to occupy. The firelight caught, faintly, the pale silver thread of the long-heeled mark at the outer edge of his right eyebrow. His grave mouth moved once, as a man's mouth moves, who is about to say something he has considered for many hours and has not yet let himself say. "I shall not trouble you with a proposal, Rosalind, until I have been a creditable man again for as many months as I have been a hermit. But I ask your leave, if it does not weary you, to let me try." There was a small silence. Lady Charlotte's needle moved quietly through her silks and did not pause. Rosalind drew a slow breath. She said in her warm, low voice, with the smallest lift at the end of the sentence that was not quite a smile, "Your Grace, I shall read to you, and I shall dine with you, and I shall walk in the garden with you, and I shall not go away. You may try as long as you wish. I am not in any haste to be loved less." Benedict did not speak for a full minute. The fire breathed. The bracket clock struck the half-hour very faintly upon the far shelf. At last he stirred. He reached out, across the hearthrug, with the sureness of a man who had begun to learn her movements by heart. His long, careful hand found her hand quite easily, closed gently about her fingers, and lifted the back of her hand. He turned it in his own with the courtesy of an older age. He laid his mouth against the centre of her palm. Once, very lightly, with a grave tenderness that was not a claim but a promise of patience, and let her hand go. Lady Charlotte did not look up from her embroidery. In the primrose room, the fire had been built up. The four-poster stood ready, its pale yellow silk hangings drawn half back, the white linen counterpane turned down. Upon the walnut writing desk, beside her mother's travel diary, a fresh narcissus had been set in a glass. She undressed slowly. She unpinned her honey gold hair and let it fall to the middle of her back. She drew the white lawn nightgown over her head, wrapped the dressing gown about her, crossed to the bow window, and drew back the curtain. The moon was up over the Atlantic, a high, cold silver. The walled garden below was a pattern of black box hedges upon silver gravel. She thought, with a small, calm wonder, that 3 weeks ago she had come up the cliff path to this house with a trunk, £40 in banknotes, and a character reference from her late uncle's old curate. 3 weeks. And tonight she stood in a proper bedchamber of the south wing, with a pale yellow silk four-poster behind her, a dowager lady in the room next door who had told her to ring at any hour, and a man downstairs who had asked her leave, in the presence of his aunt, to be permitted to try. She thought of Clarissa's crimson silk, the overdressed gown at 3 in the afternoon, the plumes, the parure, the single extended finger, the full red mouth that had smiled as it cut. She found she was not angry, she was not triumphant. She only smiled, very slightly to herself in the dark glass of the window, a small private smile that nobody would ever see, and put it away, because it was not the kind of smile a gentlewoman kept. She drew the curtain. She blew out the candle. She climbed into the four-poster and drew the clean linen counterpane to her chin. The bracket clock in the library below struck midnight. Far off from the tower of St. Margaret's, the bell answered it. The Primrose Room was quiet. She slept. A fortnight passed at Harlow as quietly as water that has at last found its level. The sleet had gone out of the weather. Upon the south wall of the walled garden, the camellia bushes, which had stood through January as stiff, dark, lacquered green, had begun their slow inward change. The buds had thickened, a faint carmine line had shown at the tip of each, and in the last 3 days the foremost sprays had cracked open upon a blush-white petal, folded as close as a letter, not yet unsealed. Mrs. Pendarvis had pointed them out to Rosalind on the Wednesday, with the small satisfaction of a Cornish woman who has watched the same wall for 40 springs. In that fortnight, Rosalind and Benedict walked every afternoon in the walled garden. Lieutenant Courtney no longer came with them. Benedict, in his plain black, superfine tailcoat and charcoal trousers, laid his hand upon Rosalind's forearm rather than upon Courtney's, and she, in the slate-grey muslin and cream cashmere shawl, walked at a pace adjusted so exactly to his own that the ebony walking-stick swung as a courtesy rather than a need. Lady Charlotte, in slate-grey widow's silk and her neat white lace cap, chaperoned from the stone bench beside the sundial, an embroidery frame upon her knees and a half-worked spray of honeysuckle growing under her needle. She did not often look up. He was learning her, in that fortnight, as a man learns a new country. He had begun to know, by the small whisper of muslin against gravel, when Rosalind paused at a bed of narcissi. He could tell her step from Lady Charlotte's on the flags of the hall. In the library each evening she read him Cowper and Scott, and, for 3 evenings now, The Tempest, Ariel's songs coming out of her warm, low voice into the dark oak room like small, clean birds. The old hard stillness of a man who would not be comforted was no longer in him. Rosalind, in her turn, had begun to let herself believe, with the measured steps of a creature long hunted, that she was safe. She was not yet. At a house in Half Moon Street in London, in the same fortnight, Mrs. Horatia Dalrymple had received Lady Clarissa Penhale's letter of polite sisterly inquiry, had read it twice, and had forwarded the whole of it, with a note of her own, to her husband's cousin in Bloomsbury. The letter had lain upon a breakfast table for 3 days, and then, upon the morning that the first blush-white camellia opened at Harlow, it had been carried in upon a silver tray by a soft-footed London servant to Sir Percy Marlowe. Sir Percy was at his late breakfast. He was 38, thinning sandy blonde hair combed forward in the Brutus style, his small, shallow, pale blue eyes set too close together above a long upper lip. His complexion was florid. Across the bridge of his narrow nose, the broken veins of a great many seasons of claret made a dull lacework. His chin was weak, his mouth fixed in its permanent half-smile of self-satisfaction. He was 5'9" and soft with a pronounced paunch beneath the primrose-yellow silk waistcoat. His bottle-green tailcoat with its gilt buttons lay across the chair-back, his buff pantaloons well creased, his black Hessian boots with gold tassels shone, a heavy gold watch chain with 3 fob seals hung at his waistcoat pocket, and his quizzing glass upon its black ribbon lay beside his coffee cup. He read the letter twice. He laid it down. The sum of it was simple. His ward Rosalind, whom he had supposed tutoring infants in some Kentish vicarage, was installed at Harlow Castle as reader to the blind Duke, and the servants' hall at Penhall Court believed a marriage was in prospect. Sir Percy had not considered the Duke of Harlow. He had considered a governess post, a slow obscurity in which his cousin would sink quietly past her 25th birthday in the coming October. Upon that birthday, unmarried, the small matter of her mother's settlement, £6,000 in the 3%, separately drawn by his late uncle Sir Edward in 1803, long before the question of the will had ever been thought of, would lapse to him by survivorship as next male heir, provided she had not married before. A marriage to a duke would take it out of his hands forever, and would put her, socially, where the forged codicil could be torn to pieces by any competent chancery barrister her new husband cared to set upon it. He sat for some minutes with his pale eyes upon the cold toast. Then, with the practised efficiency of a man who had weighed risks for a living, he rose and weighed 2 courses. He might, moving fast, reach Cornwall before any offer had been made, and remove her as her guardian cousin upon the face of a codicil no country attorney had yet examined, and then, in Bloomsbury, settle the matter by marriage himself, or, if she proved contumacious, by the recommendation of a certain Dr. Willoughby of Hackney, who, for a reasonable consideration, would commit any young woman upon the certificate of her nearest kinsman as being of unsound mind. He folded Mrs. Dalrymple's letter into his pocket-book with the codicil, drew on the bottle-green coat, and by 4 that afternoon was on the Western Road. At Harlow, the same afternoon, Mr. Hugh Trewin rode up the cliff path with a leather dispatch case strapped to his saddle. Trewin was 52, close-cropped, iron-grey hair receding at the temples, a square, honest, weathered face with a small pale scar upon the chin from a boyhood fall, steady grey-green eyes, lean and wiry at 5'11". He wore his plain dark-brown wool coat, buff waistcoat, brown cord breeches, brown leather gaiters, and his leather-bound ledger under his arm. In the dispatch case were the 2 documents Benedict had set him upon a fortnight earlier, the morning after Clarissa's barouche had turned under the gatehouse arch, when the Duke had said that he should be obliged if the Harlow solicitor's London agent, Mr. Bellingham of Lincoln's Inn, would be put in instant motion. Bellingham had moved. He had sought out Mr. Samuel Hollis, the clerk who had copied the true will of Sir Edward Marlowe in August 1810, and had procured from him a sworn affidavit. He had engaged Mr. Ransom of the College of Arms, acknowledged in the courts as the best living authority upon disputed hands, to set the codicil against 11 undoubted specimens of the late Sir Edward's signature. Both documents, the subpoenaed codicil and Bellingham's covering letters, were now in Trewin's case. He delivered them to the Duke's own hand in the library at 6, and stood in grave silence as the solicitor read the whole pack through aloud to his master. Benedict listened without moving. When it was done, he said, very quietly, "Mr. Trewin, Be so good as to keep the hall upon your person tomorrow. I think we may receive a visitor. If we do, you will be wanted. The visitor came at 11 the next morning. A hired post-chaise from the Launceston posting inn drew up at the gatehouse under a thin spring sun, and a florid gentleman in a bottle-green coat with gilt buttons climbed down, quizzing-glass swinging upon its black ribbon. He did not wait for a servant. He strode up the flagged path to the great door and hammered upon the oak with the silver head of a Malacca cane. Lieutenant James Courtney opened it himself. He was 26, wiry at 5'10", close-cropped, dark auburn hair in the regimental cut, frank hazel eyes, a sun-browned Irish face. He wore the plain dark blue undress coat of the 7th Light Dragoons, no epaulets, no gold, white waistcoat, white breeches, black top boots. He carried no weapon. His hands were clasped behind his back. "Sir, I am Sir Percy Marlowe. I am come for my ward, my cousin Miss Marlowe, who left my guardianship improperly in January. I have letters. I shall have chancery upon this house if I am kept waiting on the step." Courtney did not alter his expression. He inclined his head the civil quarter-inch. "Sir Percy, His Grace will receive you in the library. Allow me to show you the way." He turned and led him without haste down the long stone corridor to the oak door at the end. The library was as it had been. Dark oak shelves to the ceiling, the Cornish granite hearth at the far end, 2 deep green leather wing-back chairs turned toward the fire. Benedict sat in the farther chair, his ebony walking-stick leaning against the chair arm. His chestnut hair had been brushed, his white shirt properly collared, the pale grey-blue clouded eyes were fixed at nothing, but his posture was still. Rosalind sat in the other wing-back, on the hearth-side, the slate-grey muslin drawn over her crossed ankles, the cream cashmere shawl about her shoulders. She had been forewarned. She had taken her chair and set her hands in her lap, and had not let them tremble. Lady Charlotte sat upon an upright chair in the exact middle of the room, in her slate-grey widow's silk, her embroidery frame untouched upon her knee, the proper chaperone in the proper place. Reverend Penrose stood at the end of the library table, in his plain black clerical coat, his watery blue eyes behind the small silver-rimmed spectacles, mild and attentive. He had been asked as witness, not as priest. Mr. Trewin stood at the side table with Bellingham's pack laid open before him. Hollis's affidavit, Ransom's deposition, the codicil, the covering letters in a neat square. Courtney took his place at the library door with his hands clasped behind his back. There were no weapons in the room. Sir Percy came 3 steps across the Turkey carpet, saw the Duke, the old clergyman, the steward, the dowager, the quiet young man at the door, and checked. He recovered his practised half-smile. He did not advance further. He did not, throughout the 3/4 of an hour that followed, set eyes upon Rosalind. Benedict's choice of the farther wing-back kept her beyond his line of sight. Her face turned toward the fire. "Your Grace," said Sir Percy, upon a bow a half-inch shallower than was civil. "I am come for my ward, Miss Rosalind Marlowe, who is presently within these walls. Upon Sir Edward's decease last September, his codicil constituted me her guardian at law. She removed herself from my house in Bloomsbury in January without my consent. I have here—" He drew the folded codicil from his breast. "Her uncle's hand. My appointment as guardian until her 25th year. I have letters from 2 attorneys in town. I shall have chancery upon this house, your Grace, unless she is restored to me this hour." He had spoken with rising colour. Benedict had listened with his head turned very slightly to one side, his expression unaltered. He had heard every sentence of the codicil already, read to him at 9 that morning by the candlelight of his own solicitor. He did not interrupt. When Sir Percy had finished, Benedict lifted one long hand from the arm of his chair, the smallest gesture, and said, without raising his voice at all, "Mr. Trowin, read to Sir Percy the affidavit of Mr. Hollis the clerk." Trewin's square, weathered face did not move. He took up the first paper. "I, Samuel Hollis, Clerk at Law of Gray's Inn, do solemnly swear," he read in his level Cornish baritone, "that in the month of August, in the year of our Lord, 1810, I copied the last will and testament of Sir Edward Marlowe, Baronet of Bloomsbury in the county of Middlesex, from the draft dictated by him to my principal, that I was present at its execution and sealing, that the said will made his niece, Miss Rosalind Marlowe, sole legatee of the freehold house in Great Russell Street, and of the £6,000 3 per cent. Consolidated annuities, then standing in his name, that the codicil now produced by Sir Percy Marlowe is wholly unknown to me, was never witnessed in my presence, and cannot, upon the knowledge of the deponent, be the act of his late employer. Sworn this 18th day of March, 1812. A small silence. "And now," said Benedict quietly, "the deposition of Mr. Ransom of the College of Arms." Trewin took up the second paper. He read it through. Ransom's deposition was precise and unhurried. The signature upon the codicil did not match in flourish, pressure, or foot any of the 11 acknowledged specimens of Sir Edward Marlowe's hand set beside it. The capital E, in particular, was formed with a foot-loop, contrary to the deceased's lifelong habit, which carried the loop below the line. The paper bore the watermark of a mill that had first laid that stock in 1811, a post-mortem year, whereas the codicil purported upon its face to have been executed in August of 1810. The wax seal carried the impression of a falcon's head crest, unknown to any of Sir Edward's papers of record. It corresponded, rather, to a ring inherited by Sir Percy Marlowe himself only in December 1811, 3 months after his uncle's death. The document, Ransom's deposition concluded in Trewin's quiet reading, is a forgery upon its face, and would be pronounced so by any jury of gentlemen. Sir Percy had gone dead white under his floridness. The broken veins across his nose stood out in a dull purple trace. His small pale eyes moved from the steward's papers to the blind duke in the chair, to the old clergyman and back again. His permanent half-smile had not quite deserted him, but it had become fixed, like an expression cut into wax. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried to bluster. "Your Grace, these are private depositions, obtained without my knowledge, taken in the absence of my own counsel. I shall have them tested in open court. I am not to be browbeaten by—" Benedict lifted one hand again, a quarter inch. Sir Percy stopped. "Sir Percy," said the Duke, still without raising his voice. The deep, quiet baritone carried across the hearthrug as clearly as if he had been speaking to himself. "You have 3 choices. First, you may pursue this codicil in Chancery, where it will be struck down in a morning, and where your name will be associated, in print, with a criminal forgery. Second, you may withdraw it this hour. Sign a deed of renunciation for any pretended guardianship over Miss Marlowe. Acknowledge in writing that the Bloomsbury house and the consols were and are Miss Marlowe's sole property by the true will, and return to London with the understanding that Harlow is her house henceforth, and my aunt her chaperone. Third, you may attempt to remove her from this house by force, in which case my friend Lieutenant Courtney, who has some experience of persuading men to reconsider their intentions, will escort you to the post road. I should add, Sir Percy, that my friend is a very quiet man. His persuasions, when they come, are effective." Not a syllable had been raised. Courtney at the door had not moved. His hazel eyes were steady. Rosalind, in the farther chair, had not stirred. The long case clock showed 11:15. Sir Percy's mouth worked. He looked for the first and only time at the quiet man beside the door, at the frank Irish face which would, one suspected, remain quite as steady upon a post road as upon a library rug. Then he looked at Benedict, who had not moved, then at Trowan's papers. "I should like," he said at last, "a chair." Mr. Trowan set one at the side table. Sir Percy sat. His hand, as he drew off his glove, was not steady. When Trowan laid the deed of renunciation before him, Bellingham had prepared the form a week earlier, with a blank for the date. He took up the pen, dipped it, and had to set it down again. Trowan, without comment, steadied the inkpot with 2 fingers. Sir Percy signed. He signed the separate acknowledgment of the true will. He signed the memorandum that the Bloomsbury House and the Consols were, and had always been, the property of Miss Rosalind Marlowe. Penrose witnessed each signature. Trowan witnessed after him. At 12:30, Sir Percy was upon his feet. He made a shallow bow to the Duke's chair. Benedict did not turn his head. A bow of the same depth to Lady Charlotte, and none at all to the hearth side of the room, for he had not, at any moment, been permitted to see who sat there. Courtney walked the full length of the corridor at his elbow, stood bareheaded upon the doorstep, while the hired post-chaise was brought round, and did not go inside until the wheels had turned under the gatehouse arch and were lost upon the Launceston road. The library settled. Reverend Penrose bent his silver-white head and said, very quietly, a short prayer of thanksgiving for the vindication of the innocent, for peace restored in a house, for the confounding of falsehood by the patient work of honest men. Lady Charlotte rose, crossed the carpet, bent above Rosalind's chair, and drew her into a wordless embrace. Trowan gathered Bellingham's papers into the dispatch case. Courtney came in from the corridor and closed the oak door of the library very softly behind him. Benedict did not move for a long minute. He sat as he had sat throughout, his clouded pale grey-blue eyes at nothing, his hand upon the arm of the wing-back, his grave mouth composed. Then, at last, he turned his face half toward the fire and said, not loudly, as one who had been considering the speech for an hour, "Your uncle's house in Bloomsbury is yours from this hour. Your mother's settlement is yours. You are not, and have never been, destitute. I am sorry it has taken me a fortnight to restore to you what was yours. I should have had Bellingham on it the morning after the recognition." Rosalind rose. She crossed the hearthrug in her grey muslin. She knelt a little beside his chair, took his long, careful hand between both of hers, and laid her brow for a breath against the back of his fingers. Then she looked up. Her sea-grey eyes, with their hint of pale blue-green, were quite clear. Benedict. It was the first time she had used his Christian name aloud. He heard it. His grave mouth moved once. "I do not care about the house. I do not care about the Consols. I care that you have had me defended in your own library without raising your voice, and without letting him set eyes upon me. That is a kind of love I had not known existed." He did not answer for a moment. Then he turned his hand, very gently, and closed it about her fingers. That evening, after dinner, they returned to the library. Lady Charlotte carried her embroidery frame to the chair beside the far leaded window, in full view and at a delicate distance, and bent her silver-brown head to her half-worked honeysuckle. Benedict sat in his wing-back. Rosalind sat in hers. The fire breathed. Outside, the Atlantic wind moved, in its long, clean way, against the leaded panes. Benedict said, very quietly, "I have loved you since I heard you sing one aria behind a folding screen in May 1808. I have believed for 4 years that such a voice must belong to a woman of soul and wit. I have lived with you in this house 6 weeks and found myself underprepared for how much more the woman contained than the voice ever suggested. Rosalind, I will not ask you yet. I promised you months, and you shall have them. But I ask your leave to ask you, when the camellias open upon the south wall, may I?" She said in her warm, low voice, "You may." He reached for her hand. He found it quite easily now. He had learned in a fortnight of walking at her side the habit of her movements. He lifted her hand, turned it in his own, and kissed the centre of her palm, once, very lightly, and laid the palm for a moment against his cheek and released it. Neither of them spoke again that evening. Lady Charlotte did not look up from her embroidery. St. Morgan's bell sounded 10 across the dark fields. Through the rest of March and into April, the camellia buds upon the south wall thickened, reddened at their tips, and swelled. Rosalind read to Benedict every evening, Cowper, Scott, more of The Tempest, a little of Herrick. Lady Charlotte sat at her writing desk an hour each morning and composed letters in her neat fine hand, which she sealed herself and sent by the post rider to Launceston. Their direction was the Morning Post, the Gentleman's Magazine, and certain of the London Marlowe relations, though Rosalind did not yet know it. Courtney, in the walled garden, began to teach Rosalind how to lead Benedict at a walk without his walking stick, first 10 paces, then 20, then the length of the gravel walk to the sundial and back. And Mrs. Pendarves, upon the first warm afternoon of April, took down from the high kitchen shelf a tin she had not looked at in 18 months and made the Duke a Cornish saffron cake with her own hands, as she had been used to make it for him as a boy. He ate 2 slices. The middle of May came to the North Cornish coast with a softness that surprised even the oldest gardener at Harlow. The Atlantic wind, which through March had gone at the cliffs in long clean lines, had eased at last into a gentler trade from the southwest, as if the sea itself had consented to the season. The narcissi, which had blazed through the walled garden since the first week of March, were nearly over. Their pale petals lay in drifts along the gravel walks. But upon the long south wall, where the stone kept the day's warmth, the camellias had come into full flowering, deep rose pink, cream flushed with carmine, blush white with golden hearts, and the bees moved among them in the slow, heavy traffic of a country afternoon. It was a fresh spring morning, and Rosalind walked alone along the gravel between the box hedges. She wore the plain, high-waisted, slate-grey muslin gown she had worn into the house in February, and the cream cashmere shawl about her shoulders, and her honey-gold hair was pinned in its smooth, low chignon, with the small wisps at the temples that she could not, however careful her pins, ever quite keep in. A small silver cross rested at her throat upon its black silk cord. The grass was wet about her hem. From the village below the sea could be heard in its quiet morning lift and fall. She had come because Benedict was to meet her there, and he had asked it of her the night before, and she had known from the careful way he said it what he intended. She heard them before she saw them, the even tread of Courtney's boots upon the path, and the slightly uneven tread of Benedict's. They came through the archway in the yew hedge together, Courtney in his plain dark blue undress coat, his close-cropped dark auburn hair catching the light, and Benedict upon his arm in the plain black, superfine tailcoat, no cravat, his chestnut hair a little less overlong now that the valet had been permitted at it, his pale grey blue eyes, clouded and gentle and fixed at nothing, and his whole face turned toward the sound of her shawl upon the grass. Courtney led him as far as the sundial, loosed his arm, put the Duke's hand upon the stone rim, and without a word paced off 10 steps down the far path and stood with his hands clasped behind him. The lieutenant had acquired, over 9 weeks, a very useful sense of when he was not to be present. Benedict lifted his head and said, in his quiet, deep baritone, "Rosalind." "I am here," she said, and went to him. He offered his arm. She slipped her hand into the crook of it as she had learned to do, and they walked together, slowly, along the gravel toward the south wall, where the camellias were thickest. At the south wall, he stopped. The stone was warm at his back. The bees moved among the blossoms above his head. He turned his face a little toward her. His clouded, pale grey-blue eyes were fixed at nothing, but the lashes were long and his grave mouth had softened. "You know what I have to ask you," he said. "I have rehearsed it for 6 weeks, and I find in the moment that I have nothing particular to say. Will you marry me, Rosalind Marlowe?" She stood very still for a breath, the shawl at her shoulders lifting a little in the morning air. Somewhere below the cliffs, a gull called, long and thin, over the Atlantic, and was answered by another further out to sea. "I shall, Benedict," she said. "I meant to, from the moment you corrected my Latin." He laughed. It was a small laugh, half a cough, surprised out of him. The first he had laughed in 4 years, certainly the first since he had come home to Harlow. Courtney, 10 paces down the path with his back turned, heard it, and his shoulders moved once, and he did not look round. And Rosalind heard it, and the tears came up in her sea-grey eyes and did not fall, because she was smiling. Benedict raised his right hand. He found her jaw with the sureness of a man who had mapped the woman's voice into the space around him over 9 careful weeks. He did not fumble. He did not miss. And he kissed her, very gently once, upon the mouth. The kiss was not hurried. It was the kiss of a man who had waited 4 years and had decided, upon the south wall of his own garden, that he would take one moment and do it properly and then go on. A camellia petal came loose from the wall above them and lodged in her honey-gold hair. He did not see it. She did not brush it away. He drew back, kept his hand a moment at her jaw, and then let it fall, and took her hand again into the crook of his arm. They turned and walked, slowly, back toward the sundial, and Courtney, hearing them come, resumed his post at the Duke's other side, and gave Rosalind one quick, frank Irish smile and said nothing at all. In the fortnight that followed, Harlow became, for the first time in 16 months, a house of errands. Lady Charlotte Harrington travelled the 3 days to Bath, and ordered from a mantua maker in Milsom Street a simple gown of fine cream silk. No lace, no silver thread, no embroidery of any kind, and came back in a week with the gown folded in tissue in a long cedar box. Mr. Hugh Trewin, at his writing desk in the steward's office, drafted the marriage settlements in his neat legal hand, and Mr. Bellingham of Lincoln's Inn, the Harlow solicitor, a small, spare, greying man of 60 in a black coat and gold spectacles, came down himself from London by the Exeter mail, and witnessed the execution of the deeds at the long oak table in the library, with Benedict's Harlow signet pressed into the red wax at the foot of each page, and Rosalind's small clear hand beneath his own. The Bloomsbury house, her uncle's house, her own house now, restored through Bellingham's quiet offices in the last weeks of April, was formally re-entered upon the rolls in her name. And on a bright Tuesday in the 2nd week of May, a small stiff letter came up from Launceston in the Morning Post with a London direction and a spidery hand Rosalind did not at first know. She opened it in the breakfast room, Lady Charlotte opposite her over the chocolate pot, and read it through twice, and laid it down, and put her hands flat on the either side of it on the cloth. It was from Signora Francesca Albertini, her old music mistress of Bloomsbury, her mother's closest friend, a small, brisk Venetian woman who had taught Rosalind her first Italian phrasing at 7 and her last aria at 18. The Signora had been trying to trace her for 2 months. She had only last week learned through the Harlow solicitor's London agent that her dear child was alive, and in Cornwall, and to be married. Enclosed in the same post, in a small tin box tied with string, the Signora was sending the contents of another tin box, a box she had kept upon her own shelf, untouched, since Eliza Marlowe's death, because she had always meant for Rosalind to have them upon her marriage, and she thanked the Lord that she had lived to send them. The box was brought in an hour later. Rosalind carried it to her sitting room, with Lady Charlotte at her side, shut the door, and cut the string. Inside, wrapped in old white tissue, 2 miniatures in ivory ovals, her father, Captain James Marlowe, in the blue regimental coat, her mother, Eliza Ashton of Harrogate, in white muslin with a single rose at the shoulder. A small black velvet pouch held her mother's pearl earrings and her mother's small gold pinky ring, plain, much worn. And at the bottom of the box, pressed between 2 thin leaves of card, a single narcissus, petals gone ivory with age, the trumpet still faintly yellow, that her mother had picked on her wedding morning in 1788, had laid between the pages of her prayer book, and had given to Signora Albertini before she died, saying, "For my daughter, when her turn comes." Rosalind sat with the pressed narcissus in her palm, and she wept. She had not wept over the forged will. She had not wept on the road to Cornwall. She had not wept at Sir Percy's forgery on the library table. She wept now, in silence, with her honey-gold head bent. And Lady Charlotte, who had buried a husband and understood, held her without a word until it was finished. What Rosalind did not know, even yet, was that Lady Charlotte had been busy upon her behalf through all the weeks of March and April. The shrewd, warm brown eyes had not missed a syllable of Sir Percy's January slander, and Lady Charlotte had taken the matter in hand in the quietest way through Mr. Bellingham in London. 3 letters, in her neat fine hand, had travelled up the Exeter Road. The first to the editor of the Morning Post, correcting in measured language the false account of January, and stating, for the public record, that Miss Rosalind Marlowe of Bloomsbury, only daughter of the late Captain James Marlowe of the 16th Foot and of Eliza Ashton of Harrogate, had never fled any house in disgrace, and was presently the affianced bride of His Grace the Duke of Harlow. The second, to the Gentleman's Magazine, supplying a brief notice for the marriages column of the May issue. The third, private and direct, to the Marlowe relations at Portman Square, who had cut Rosalind in January, on Sir Percy's word, setting out the true state of affairs, and asking, with iron civility, whether they wished to repair the breach. The Morning Post printed the notice upon the 24th of April. The Gentleman's Magazine's announcement appeared in the first week of May. By the second week of May, the story was in every drawing-room in Mayfair, and the Portman Square Marlowes had written a long apologetic letter to Harlow, which Rosalind read with a small, even smile, and folded and laid away. The effect beyond Harlow was not slow. Lady Clarissa Penhale, who through the winter had let it be understood in her London circle that she herself was to be the new Duchess of Harlow, read the Morning Post notice over her breakfast at Penhale Court, and did not come down to dinner that evening. Within the fortnight, she had packed her trunks, accepted the long-standing invitation of a distant cousin at Naples, and left Cornwall by the Plymouth road. She did not return to Cornwall that year. Sir Percy Marlowe, in Bloomsbury, received his own copy of the Morning Post, and in the same post, a stiff small envelope from the Lord Chancellor's clerk at Lincoln's Inn, signifying in 3 careful lines that the handwriting deposition obtained by the Harlow solicitor was now upon the Chancery file, a private notice, unprinted, but very ruinous indeed to a man who had built his credit upon a forged codicil. By the end of April, he had been dropped from 2 clubs. By the middle of May, he had quitted Bloomsbury and retired with his wife to a small Yorkshire estate of hers, where he was received nowhere of consequence. He did not appear at the wedding. he would not be mentioned in that house again. The wedding day came upon the last Thursday of May. St. Morgan's Parish Church in Harlow Village stood upon a low green rise above the harbour. A small 14th-century stone building with a squat square tower and a lich gate of weathered oak, whitewashed within, floored in worn flagstones, its plain oak pews polished by 5 centuries of Sunday elbows. The narrow lancet windows let in a pale green summer light, filtered through the young leaves of the churchyard limes. Mrs. Pendarvis, with her niece and 2 of the village girls, had spent the Wednesday tying posies of white narcissi and camellias, cream and blush and pale rose, to each pew end with long streamers of white silk ribbon, and upon the simple oak altar stood a silver cross between 2 tall brass candlesticks, and the candles were lit, though it was not yet 10 in the morning. Reverend Arthur Penrose waited at the altar in his white linen surplice over the black cassock, his small silver crucifix on its black silk cord resting upon his breast, his gentle watery blue eyes behind their small silver-rimmed spectacles moving over the congregation with a quiet pleasure. Lieutenant James Courtney stood groomsman at Benedict's right hand in his plain dark blue undress coat of the 7th Light Dragoons, no epaulets, no gold, no sabre, no weapon of any kind upon his person, his close-cropped, dark auburn hair neatly brushed, his frank hazel eyes turned steadily toward the door. In the front pew on the bride's side, Lady Charlotte Harrington sat in half-mourning lavender silk with a white lace fichu and her small jet cross and her widow's cap of white lace, her shrewd, warm brown eyes very bright. In the second pew, Mrs. Pendarvis wept silently into a clean-folded linen handkerchief, her iron grey bun tidy beneath a plain white linen cap, her black bombazine pressed and her chatelaine, for once, laid aside. Mr. Trowan stood at the back in his best dark brown wool coat, with his hands clasped in front of him. The tenant farmers of the Harlow estate filled the nave in their Sunday blacks, their wives and daughters in straw bonnets and clean white aprons, and at the back of the church, straight-backed and solemn, stood the lead miners from the next valley in dark Sunday coats, brushed for the occasion, who had walked the 7 miles over the moor before breakfast to see their Duke married. At 10, the bells of St. Morgan's began. Benedict stood at the altar in the plain dark blue coat of his old regimental cut. The coat he had worn at Badajoz, cleaned and relined for this day with a black silk waistcoat, a white cravat properly tied by his valet's careful hand, fitted charcoal trousers and polished black Hessian boots, and upon the smallest finger of his right hand the Harlow ducal signet in heavy gold, the falcon on the gauntlet turned inward. His thick, dark chestnut hair had been trimmed, his pale grey-blue eyes were fixed at nothing, as they would always be fixed at nothing, but his whole face was lifted and turned very slightly toward the door, and listening. The door opened, and Rosalind came up the aisle upon Mr. Bellingham's arm. The small, spare, greying London solicitor, in his plain black coat and his gold spectacles, standing in that mourning for the father she had lost when she was 17, and she wore a simple gown of fine cream silk, without lace, without silver thread, without any ornament of any kind, save her mother's pearl earrings at her ears, her mother's small gold pinky ring upon the smallest finger of her right hand, a pair of plain white silk gloves, and the tiny silver cross upon its black silk cord at her throat. Upon her loose, honey-gold hair, which for this morning alone she wore unpinned down her back, rested a small coronet of white narcissus and green ivy that Mrs. Pendarvis had woven for her at dawn. Her sea-grey eyes, with their hint of pale blue-green, were very clear, and a faint pink flush lay across her cheekbones, and her mouth was steady. She came to his side. She took his hand. He knew hers at once. They were married in the simple form of the Book of Common Prayer, as it had been read in that church for 250 years. Penrose asked, in his gentle, quiet voice, "Wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband?" And Rosalind replied in the warm, low contralto that had travelled 4 years across a screen and a war and a winter, "I will." He asked, "Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife?" And Benedict said, not loudly, but with a lift in the grave baritone that those who loved him would remember all their lives, "I will, and gladly." The rings were plain gold bands. Benedict had caused the Harlow falcon to be engraved upon the inner face of each. He set hers upon her finger with a sure touch. She set his upon his own with her hand that did not tremble. And in the worn parish register, in her clear, even hand, she signed her married name for the first time, Rosalind Marlowe Harrington. When they came out under the Lich Gate, the bells of St. Margaret's had already begun, and they rang for half an hour across the green fields and down the cliff path to the sea. And the villagers threw handfuls of white narcissi and handfuls of grain at the bride as the carriage rolled up the lane toward the granite headland and the castle upon it, and the Atlantic beyond. That evening, the house was quiet. Lady Charlotte had retired to the Rose Chamber at 9. Courtney had bowed and withdrawn. Penrose had gone home in his pony trap. Trewin had ridden down to the gatehouse. Mrs. Pendarves, before she climbed the back stairs to her pantry, had ordered every candle in every sconce lit and every hearth stacked high with apple wood, so that Harlow Castle, seen from the cliff path, stood that night upon its headland, blazing at every window like a lamp upon a long road, and in the library, alone, the Duke and Duchess of Harlow sat by the fire. She was still in the cream silk wedding gown, the coronet of narcissus and ivy she had set aside upon the side table, but one narcissus had caught in her loose, honey-gold hair and drooped there gently, wilting now, and she had not taken it out. He was still in the plain, dark blue regimental coat. The 2 green leather wingback chairs were turned to the hearth as they had always been. The fire breathed. The Atlantic moved, in its long, clean way, against the cliffs below the leaded windows. Rosalind reached to the side table and drew toward her a small, calf-bound volume she had set there an hour before. It was Reverend Penrose's copy of Cowper's Task, open still at Book 6, at the same passage she had read upon the evening of the recognition in February. She opened the book upon her lap. The firelight fell warm upon the page. She read, in the warm, low contralto that had been the single thread pulling him home across 4 years, "Now stir the fire, and close the shutters fast. Let fall the curtains, wheel the sofa round, and while the bubbling and loud hissing urn throws up a steamy column, and the cups, that cheer but not inebriate, wait on each. So let us welcome peaceful evening in." When she finished, she laid the book, still open, upon her knee. She did not look up at once. When she did, she looked at him, at the grave chestnut-haired face in the firelight, the clouded, pale grey-blue eyes that looked at nothing and had never once made her feel unseen. "I shall read to you every evening of our lives, if you wish," she said. He turned his head a little. The firelight moved along the edge of his jaw. "I shall know your voice in every room I ever sit in," he said, in his quiet, deep baritone. "I shall know it if I live to 80. I shall know it at the last." He paused. The fire breathed. The Atlantic breathed. Somewhere above the house, a gull called once over the cliff and was gone. "I found you, Rosalind," he said very quietly. "One line more." She reached across the small space between the 2 chairs and laid her hand against his cheek, the hand in her mother's pinky ring, the hand in the plain gold band, and she held it there a long moment, and he turned his face a little further into her palm as he had done in the library in March. "I was always here to be found," she said. "There are love stories that begin at a ball and end at an altar." This was a love story that began behind a folding screen at Lady Eversley's in May of 1808 that was lost for 4 years to a misdirected letter and a French shell, and that ended, or began, it is hard to say which, in a Cornish library in February 1812, at the 8th stanza of Cowper's Task, when a blind duke rose from his chair and said, quietly, to a young woman in slate-grey muslin, "I know your voice." And so, at Harlow Castle, upon its granite headland, where the Atlantic came up the cliffs and the camellias opened upon the south wall and the bells of St. Morgan's still rang, faint and gold, across the evening fields, the Duke of Harlow found what he had been searching for. And the woman he had searched for, in her turn, found a house, a name, a country, and a man who had never, for 1 hour of 4 long years, stopped listening for the sound of her voice.